Hello. Today I'd like to talk about a character from Dartmoor's past, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. A man whose achievements are so numerous, eccentric and eclectic that it's difficult to know where to start. Yes, it's fair to say that I've developed a bit of a fixation. I've become absolutely obsessed with the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. The Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould has so many intriguing facets that here on the centenary of his death I would be able to fill 100 episodes of the Dartmoor podcast just talking about him. And yes, I am going to say all 8 syllables of the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould every time I mention him. It's just so much fun to say. The Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. It's like a drum fill. Ba-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum. Anyway, welcome back to the Dartmoor podcast. Yes, it's not a podcast. When I said I didn't know where to start, that's a bit of a lie. I know exactly where to start you on your journey with the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. In the same place I did, the Book of Dartmoor. A text he produced as a sort of general guide to the geography and history of the moor. You can read it all online for free, but then you wouldn't be able to thump it down dramatically on a desk. Here is a little story from the very first chapter, on Dartmoor's bogs, that immediately had me hooked. One afternoon in the year 1851, I was in the Walkham Valley above Merivale Bridge, digging into what at the time I fondly believed was a tumulus, but which I subsequently discovered to be a mound thrown up for the accommodation of rabbits when a warren was contemplated on the slope of Miss Tor. Towards evening I was startled to see a most extraordinary object approach me, a man in draggled, dingy and discolate condition, hardly able to crawl along. When he came up to me, he burst into tears, and it was some time before I could get his story from him. He was a tailor of Plymouth, who had left his home to attend the funeral of a cousin at Sandford Spiney or Walkhampton, I forget which. At that time there was no railway between Tavistock and Launceston. Communication was by coach. When the tailor on the coach reached Roborough Down, "Here you are," said the driver. "You go along there, you can't miss it," indicating a direction with his whip. So the tailor, in his glossy black suit and with his box hat set jauntily on his head, descended from the coach, leaped into the road, his umbrella also black under his arm, and with a composed countenance started along the road that had been pointed out. Where and how he missed his way he could not explain, nor can I guess, but instead of finding himself at the house of mourning and partaking there of cake and gin and dropping a sympathetic tear, he got up onto Dartmoor, and got, with considerable dexterity, away from all roads. He wandered on, becoming hungry, feeling the gloss go out of his new black suit, and roars develop upon his top hat as it got knocked against rocks in some of his falls. Night set in, and, as Homer says, all the paths were darkened. But where the tailor found himself there were no paths to become obscured. He lay in a bog for some time, unable to extricate himself. He lost his umbrella, and finally lost his hat. His imagination conjured up frightful objects. If he did not lose his courage, it was because, as a tailor, he had none to lose. He told me incredible tales of the large, glaring-eyed monsters that had stared at him as he lay in the bog. They were probably sheep. But as 9 tailors fled when a snail put out its horns, no wonder that this solitary member of the profession was scared at a sheep. The poor wretch had eaten nothing since the morning of the preceding day. Happily I had half a Cornish pasty with me, and I gave it him. He fell on it ravenously. Then I showed him the way to the little inn at Merivale Bridge, and advised him to hire a trap there and get back to Plymouth as quickly as might be. "I solemnly swear to you, sir," said he, "nothing will ever induce me to set foot on Dartmoor again. If I chance to see it from the Hoe, sir, I'll avert my eyes. How can people think to come here for pleasure, sir? There are depraved appetites among human beings, and only unwholesome-minded individuals can love Dartmoor." And I think you can see why I was intrigued. There's something so paradoxical about his prose. On the one hand, he's conducting some rational and fancy-free deductions about the old rabbit warren and the beasts in the man's tale being sheep, and on the other, he's making some rather sassy assumptions about tailors. I was full of questions. Why was this priest, presumably not a trained archaeologist, just digging up Dartmoor? How was he able to deliver barbs of such arrogant and withering contempt? And what's he got against tailors, anyway? And as I began turning over stones to find my answers, I kept finding more questions. The Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould was a truly beguiling character. It's a task way beyond a short, not a podcast, to give you a complete biography of the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. But let's do a quick what, which, why, how, when, where, who of the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. The Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould was born here, in Southern Hay, Exeter, in 1834, into an upper-class family owning land and a manor on the western edge of Dartmoor. Rather than a conventional schooling, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's childhood was spent travelling Europe, leading him to speak at least 6 languages. Eventually he studied at Cambridge and had a brief spell as a teacher before, against his father's wishes, being drawn to the priesthood. While working as a priest in Yorkshire, he fell in love with a young mill girl half his age, Grace Taylor, whom he married and had an astonishing 15 children. So I expect that if you grew up anywhere near Dartmoor, you're probably related to him. By the time he inherited his father's estate, the manor at Lew Trenchard, the place was falling into disrepair, and despite not being extraordinarily rich, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould dedicated his life to restoring the place. It's now a rather swanky little hotel, who very kindly let me come to film and drink tea. And here, at this writing desk, he made the money to conduct these repairs. He had over 1,000 published works in his lifetime. 38 novels, 2 novellas, some collections of short stories, collections of folk tales, hagiographies, biographies of saints, translations of Icelandic sagas, and non-fiction texts too, including the aforementioned Book of Dartmoor. Perhaps most famous of these books is The Book of Werewolves, more on this later, of which a copy exists in the British Library containing Bram Stoker's notes in the margins. It appears that it was at least partly the inspiration for Dracula. Also, obviously, he was a priest and wrote a number of hymns, the most famous being Onward Christian Soldiers. But he had an interest in folk music too, and the folkies have a lot to thank him for, as he was responsible for writing down the music and lyrics to many folk songs of the West Country, which would otherwise have been lost. Beyond that, he somehow found time to dabble in archaeology and is responsible for excavating many of the Bronze Age features on Dartmoor, as well as restoring toppled stone rows. And I haven't even mentioned that he kept a pet bat in his coat. But perhaps the most interesting thing to me is that despite all of this, the pages and pages of fiction, non-fiction and quasi-fiction, it's really hard to pin down what the man was actually like. His character remains elusive. Perhaps this book, never completely submerged, a transcript of the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's diary, might shed some light on things. Except it really doesn't. Despite being such a prolific writer, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould was a pretty bad diarist. Like many of us, he started with good intentions but then just forgot to write anything in it for years and years. When he did, it was mostly notes about how he was going to rebuild Lew Trenchard. The original copies of the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's diaries reside at the Devon Record Office, and I'm familiar enough with the conventions of TV documentaries to know that I needed to go and see the thing in the flesh to see if I could get any closer to the great man.
Don't worry about the...
So here is the Baring-Gould diary.
Oh, amazing. Like, it's real handwriting and everything.
Yeah.
Can I touch it as well?
Yeah, just turn the pages slightly by the edge rather than sort of on the surface.
Incredible.
But yeah, that's yeah. So I think this one is one of these hymns. I think it might be Onward Christian.
No, although it felt pretty special to touch the very pages the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould penned, his handwriting was quite hard to read, and again he gives away very little about himself. If I gained any insights from the diary, it was to remind me that the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould was the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. As a fairly secular chap, I forget that among the werewolves and folk songs and menhirs, he was a priest. And the diary, that which I managed to read and digest, highlights that he spent a lot of time thinking about ideas for his sermons, making pledges for Lent, or writing down the words to hymns. For the later part of his life, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould guided his flock from St. Peter's Church, literally 100 metres walk from his ancestral home of Lew Trenchard. A pretty convenient commute. And again, this highlights a uniqueness to the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's character, both the lord of the manor and the priest of the little village. Jokingly, he referred to himself as the squarson, squire and parson. Another little glimpse at his sense of humour, perhaps? It felt like the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's personality was just on the edge of discovery, and I decided on a change of tack to try and get to know the man by meeting someone who had spent some time in his shoes. The writer, Lawrence McNeela, had the wonderful idea of pitting a fictionalised Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould against a werewolf on Dartmoor. It was a delight to chat with someone as enthusiastic about the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould as myself. Lawrence, welcome to the Dartmoor podcast.
George, it's not a podcast.
Apologies. I'm so jealous of the premise of this book. It's something I wish I'd thought of. Sabine Baring-Gould, who I'm obviously a big fan of, and him hunting a werewolf, the beast of Dartmoor. Absolutely amazing. I'm guessing that would have been inspired by the Book of Werewolves at some point.
It was exactly that. I used to live around the corner from where we are now in Baring-Gould's old house at Lou Trenchard in a little village called Stowford, and I used to come here quite often for a drink, in the summer, just sit outside and enjoy the gardens. And one day I thought I should learn more about the guy. He's a fascinating character. And as I was delving into him, I saw that he'd written this Book of Werewolves, which seemed such an eccentric thing to have done.
Right, yeah.
I was instantly intrigued and read the book. And as I read the book, everything just came together in my mind. Unbidden, I would say. I didn't make any conscious decision to do it. It just came to me.
Yeah.
This would make a fantastic sort of the Hound of the Baskervilles flavour, but instead of the Hound of the Baskervilles providing a rational man-made explanation, no, let's keep it supernatural. Let's make the moor as wild and untamed and unbelievable as it can possibly be, and let's have this idea of the man's expertise in knowing about werewolves and having to deal with one. And it all just kind of wrote itself, even.
Yeah, it's the perfect like gothic setting. It sort of all just fits together just right, doesn't it? So a Book of Werewolves. It's have you actually read it? I've only read a few little bits of it.
Yeah, I read it. I read it just for fun to begin with. And the opening chapter begins with his recollections of a personal experience out in Vienne in France, where he came across a village with people who were very superstitious, very frightened. They believed they had a werewolf in their neighbourhood, and they didn't want him to walk back to his hotel on his own. But likewise, they were too frightened to escort him, provide any kind of safety. But from there, it becomes quite a highbrow study into various disparate elements of the superstition might have come from here. Here's one origin, here's another, and then the whole thing is sort of tied together with theories about why people believe this. And the book almost sums him up in that the first chapter begins like a work of fiction. His imagination is taking full reign, and it reads like a work of fiction, like a gothic romance, and then it becomes an opportunity for him to explore ancient Greece and Rome. It becomes the Viking sagas, terrible atrocities that took place in the Middle Ages, in the 19th century in Poland, and to translate from Icelandic, one of the great sagas. It's like the breadth of his knowledge was kind of laid out in that book.
Yeah, a real polymath, I think,
a real
is the
polymath,
word, isn't it?
Yeah. And I've always been fascinated by people like that. Was there nothing he couldn't turn his hand to?
Absolutely. His character's a paradox, isn't it? Because he's super rational, and he's got this sort of Holmesian logic when he's talking about like archaeology on the moor and stuff as well. But then there's this other side to him where he'll just fling out mad opinions about stuff. He's quite sort of, in his book of Dartmoor, he's sort of quite grumpy, he sort of doesn't like the Cornish, and it's like, how do these two sides sort of sit together? I find him such a fascinating character.
He was. In his writings, he comes out a truly fascinating character. As you say, someone who is brilliant at so many different things.
Yeah.
And the place that we're staying in, he rebuilt virtually from scratch with his own imagination as to what he felt an Elizabethan mansion should look like. He's the rector. He's the churchgoer. He writes hymns. He wrote, Onward Christian Soldier. People all know. He wrote books about saints and things. But at the same time, he goes onto the moor and he re-erects the menhirs and the stone circles of the pagan times, during a time in the Victorian era when that sort of thing was really frowned upon by members of the Anglican and the Catholic churches. He was quite happy to embrace the heathen and celebrate it.
Do you have a favourite Sabine Baring-Gould fact or nugget of information? That's quite a hard question to put you on the spot with.
Yeah, I do actually. It's quite. It doesn't shine a particularly favourable light on his research, but it's about his stories about what happened on Dartmoor with Old Dewar and the Whist Hounds,
right? Yeah,
and the conclusions that he came to that Old Dewar is sort of a demonisation of the Saxon god Tyr that we know Tuesday by, and really it was a Saxon god that people worshipping, and then the Christians came along and they turned him into the devil, and then he becomes the devil in the eyes of the Dartmoor people. And he tells a story, it's a ghastly story, of a farmer travelling home half cut from what's now the Two Bridges, was then the Saracen's Head, in the eponymous hamlet. And he comes across old Dewar and the Wild Hunt, and he says to him, "Ha! What ho, old Dewar, good hunting tonight?" And old Dewar says yes, and is so impressed by him being so brazen and confident to address him, he hands him a sack of meat. And when the farmer comes home and he opens the sack of meat, and onto the kitchen table, there's his dead baby. A ghastly, ghastly story.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, what I read recently is that it's a story, it's not a folklore story of Dartmoor, as Sabine Baring-Gould believed, having been told it. It's actually a German folk story that was told by one man, a blacksmith in Morton Hampstead, who was German, and it's been traced back. He told his apprentice the story to scare him and reset it on Dartmoor, and the apprentice told his family the story. And when Baring-Gould was in Widdicombe collecting folk stories, he met this man in a pub. I guess you can imagine, "I'll give you a few beers, I'll give you a few coppers if you'll tell me a story." The guy's like, "Well, yeah, this is a story I was always told." And he'd been told it by, say, his grandfather or his uncle. But it was one story that only one family knew. But Baring-Gould, in his books of folklore on Dartmoor, believes it to be a genuine Dartmoor legend. And then creates it, makes it one by the very process of having it printed and published in his books, and it becomes a Dartmoor legend. But actually, it isn't. And I think that's great, because it shows how folklore and legends start.
Yes.
And also how we we believe things that simply aren't true. And in which this case, I read that book in one of his things. I think it was the Book of Dartmoor. I read it in and thought, that's a great story. But it wasn't a Dartmoor story at all.
It's good to know that even Baring-Gould gets that temptation to, like, oh, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
Well, yeah, exactly. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if things are true or not, if they're a great story.
Do you think Baring-Gould would be do you reckon he'd be a disappointment to meet, or do you reckon he'd be a really cool person to meet? Do you think he'd be like a good dinner guest, or?
I think he would be fantastic to meet. Yes, I think he would. And actually, I'm reading a book that a friend of mine, who's a Sabine BaringGould aficionado and high up in the society, and her mum, I think, was one of the founding members of the society. And I met her here in this very hotel a couple of weeks ago. And then she found a book which also involves a fictionalised version of Baring-Gould, which she sent me and said, "Oh, you probably enjoy reading this." But it's interesting that this particular author has come out with a very, very different impression of what he would be like in her fictionalised version. And it's not necessarily a very positive version. But my one is, and that's because I imagine him being quite mischievous. The painting of him that you see online looks quite austere, but he was an old man there. He had 15 children, having married the daughter of a mill hand up in Sowerby Bridge in Yorkshire. He wasn't a snob. He let his children have free rein, sons and daughters. My understanding is that he educated them all. He wanted them to become things. He let them run pretty wild on the estate. And he himself dedicated his life to going around, amongst the other research, the pubs of the area, having a drink with the locals, collecting their stories and songs. I mean, I think he'd have been fun. I think he'd have been...
Maybe that's with 15 kids. You're like, I'm just going out to do some more research at the local pubs. Look after them, I'll be back.
and an enterprising, an intelligent and an engaging company. And so I set out in my fictionalised version of him to make sure that it did him justice,
Yeah.
and that it's positive. I think it's very, very easy to impose our views today on the past. And I think people in 100 years won't judge us particularly kindly with some of the things that we do, and how we are and how we treat other people. I'm not going to judge people for what they were in the past. The past is the past. I think he'd have been great company and a great dinner guest and would regale you with tales.
Yes.
And I would also imagine that the tales would go off at tangents halfway through being finished, because he'd suddenly realised he had something to tell you about that as well,
Yeah.
and then that, and then that, and you'd never hear the original story.
Yeah. That's great. I think that's a really good place to stop filming as well. Thank you so much for coming and talking to me about it. And I guess like you should do the sort of deconstruct the thing where I sort of plug the book at the end. It sells itself. It's what do you want? It's Sabine Baring-Gould on Dartmoor with a retired army colonel hunting a werewolf. I mean, it's just, I can't get much better than that.
And two strong female characters, very,
Yes, of
very important
course.
for 2023. I suppose it just remains to be said that it's been great meeting you, George.
Thank you very much.
Thank
No,
you very
it's
much
my
for having me on
pleasure.
your Not a Podcast.
Brilliant. Cheers.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.
At the end of the day, Lawrence and I had to admit we simply didn't know for sure what sort of man the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould was. But I think Lawrence's picture of a mischievous, down-to-earth polymath is the one I want to believe. So, I suppose if his character remains a mystery, then by his works he shall be judged. The Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould passed away exactly 100 years ago today, and is now buried in the churchyard of St. Peter's alongside his wife. And as this is the Dartmoor podcast, I think it would be apt to end by thinking specifically about its legacy to Dartmoor and its people. Without him, many of Dartmoor's much-loved antiquities, like this stone row at Stall Moor, would be lying on their side, or worse, recycled into walls and gateposts. Admittedly, he also made some rather amateur excavations of kists and cairns which might have done more harm than good, but I suppose it's unlikely that they would have remained unscathed anyway. And perhaps even more important than his preservation of the megaliths was his preservation of Dartmoor's folk music, something which the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould himself considered his proudest achievement. Together with his friends Henry Shepherd and Frederick Bussell, they visited taverns across the moor. The Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould would write down the lyrics, and his more musically talented chums would record the tunes. Again, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould was far from perfect in this respect. He is criticised for acts of bowdlerisation, frequently replacing bawdy or risque lyrics with more genteel versions of his own. But even this, I think, was done with good intentions, and, rather delightfully, it turns out that he did preserve the naughty versions too. He just kept them in a drawer rather than publishing them. Look, we all know where this is heading, right? Here's a song that would in all probability be lost to time if the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould hadn't visited a chap called Charles Arscott in South Zeal in 1894. And even then Mr. Arscott was strangely protective, allowing only the melody and not the lyrics to be noted. That is, until the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould visited him again in 1896, possibly with a few more pints of beer to lubricate the deal. Apologies in advance. I should Like for to have in the winter of life a neat little cottage for me and my wife, with a barrel of ale and a snug little fire, and food that's sufficient for all my desires. For I'm growing old and my hair it is grey, no more shall I dance with the young and the gay, for time hath determined the truth to unfold. There's a mark on my forehead to show that I'm old. A wounded old soldier I'll have with me dwell, with his cook and to hear the strange stories he'll tell, how he bested his fears and his victory gained, how he was promoted and how he got lamed. For I'm growing old and my hair it is grey, no more shall I dance with the young and the gay, for time hath determined the truth to unfold. There's a mark on my forehead to show that I'm old. The very next moment I'm gasping for breath. There at my elbow is grasping old death, but I shall not ask for one moment to stay. He's the great Lord of terrors and we must obey. For I'm growing old and my hair it is grey, no more shall I dance with the young and the gay, for time hath determined the truth to unfold. There's a mark on my forehead to show that I'm old. There's a mark on my forehead to show that I'm old. Well, I've hardly scratched the surface of the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's story. I'm sure I'll be coming back to look at his fiction, his antiquarianism, his Book of Dartmoor, his folk music, his hymns, and his life again in future. Damn it, I might even start a Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould podcast. But would it be a podcast? The Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould dedicated much of his life to conserving the works of the past for the enjoyment of the people of the future. Unlike the old man who plants a tree he will never sit in the shade of, that implies an altruistic soul. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.